Thanks, guys, for that carrier update this morning. Right now, it's time to welcome Andrew Lockwood, our guest from Side with Global Logistics, and we're talking about that interesting topic from Anthony, pallets. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Always glad to be on. Happy Friday. And yeah, pallets. They're, we never really think about pallets. It's the ubiquitous unit of measure in our industry, but they're so important on so many different levels.
It's kind of like that last afterthought, right? But it really should be the important thing, like one of the most important things, because if you've got a palletized load, you're not moving it unless you start at the base with a pallet. So let's kind of talk about how lumber prices and what happened to the lumber market during COVID all kind of play into the way that pallets are now being utilized today.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. There was absolutely a bubble going on in the lumber market there, going back to this point last summer. We saw lumber prices January 2020 were at about $430. They spiked as high as $1645, so almost 4x last summer. And they're back down to much reasonable levels, $651, but that's still a 50% increase from where they were a year ago. A couple of things to consider with the lumber market, for example. Everyone was staying at home. Everyone wanted to tackle those home projects. And what I think is very interesting on the pallet side is we've been talking a lot about growing inventories, growing demand here, consumer demand, which affects final mile and parcel. Every facet of our industry, and each facet of the industry essentially needs pallets for freight to move on. So you've had a bubble develop really, not only within the lumber industry and what's traded there, but also in the pallet stratosphere where you've got shortages of pallets with large pooled, companies that offered pooled solutions like CHEP and Payco. And so you're starting to see a little bit of we've had a bubble there for a while. It's starting to subside a little bit, but a very interesting dynamic.
Excuse me. And Andrew, when we're looking at consumer shifts from goods to services, do you see this alleviating any of the pallet situation right now?
I think so. So what I expect from a pricing standpoint, I almost think we've hit our peak right now with pallets. I talked to several individuals yesterday, specifically about this: warehouse operators, pallet recyclers, and even those that control these closed looped pooled models. If you're going to go to market in Jacksonville for a grade 1A pallet, you're looking anywhere between 15 and 18 a pallet. That represents essentially a 40% increase that's come along in three different waves of increases over the past couple months. The reason I think that we've seen the peak of pallet, kind of pallet price increases, at least for now, is you're starting to see the housing industry cool a little bit. Lumber prices are coming back from the stratosphere where they were last summer. They're still high relatively, and there's still a little bit of a bubble there. Let me explain. It's the same issue we have with ocean containers and chassis. There are pallets out there. There's ocean containers and chassis, but they're all in the wrong places. Take a model like CHEP has or a Payco, for example, where it's a quote unquote closed loop, but you really have to redistribute the pallets, and you're constantly trying to do this balancing act between where pallets are actually needed and where they are. To your question, Anthony, consumer demand, at least for physical products, we know that's cooled a little bit this year. Going back and looking at kind of the macro level transportation industry where volumes are starting to subside a little bit, I do think that's going to bring down what's been a very hot demand for pallets. But the reality remains, our warehouses are still busting at the seams. There's a lot of inventory out there. Even if it's not moving in the freight industry right now, there's a ton of inventory that freight needs to sit on, even if it's in a warehouse shelf.
And Andrew, I'm glad that you brought that up, because my follow-up question to that was going to be, with those companies that are now sitting on inventories and the warehouses that are still completely full to bursting, do we now run this risk of the inventories not moving out of those warehouses into the storefronts? So now you've got this palletized freight that's just sitting on the pallets, and you can't do anything because you can't get it off the pallet into a warehouse because there's no space for things to move. And does that run the risk of now these like pooled models kind of losing the appeal because you just can't get them cycled the way that you need to?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the pooled model is interesting in that it starts way upstream. So if I'm a cookie manufacturer, in order to sell into the channels I need to, I'm almost required sometimes to use those type of pallets or even like a polymer, plastic pallet to sell into certain distribution channels. And so you've got situations where those companies, it's not like we've got an issue producing pallets. We can produce pallets. We can cut down trees. I don't think there's any lumberjacks that go into the woods and say, let's cut down a tree and make some pallets today. But the issue is not as much about manufacturing as it is using the existing assets that are out there. And so, to your point, there's a couple of layers to that problem. You could look at it from the pallet level and say these pallets are stagnant. They're not moving. They're just holding freight. And in a much greater sense, this same inventory that's sitting on pallets is sitting on companies' balance sheets. And that, I think, represents a big problem the further time goes on. You remember that the idea behind lean inventories just in time was to try to minimize exposure on balance sheets. If you've got your cash tied up essentially with inventory. And that's, I think, the state certain companies are going to be in is they've overordered or they have a much larger amount of inventory than they have in the past. Not that there's going to be a reckoning per se, but it's something to keep an eye on, specifically for certain companies that have hedged their bet on over-ordering, overproducing now because they either believe that demand will pull it through or the demand maybe hasn't come through quite yet.
And Andrew, real quick, before we let you go here, we were talking about freight sitting on pallets. What about some companies just stockpiling pallets? Is that being a thing right now?
I've walked through a couple warehouses the last few weeks, and I have seen some very tall towers of empty pallets. The backside of the industry is very interesting. And what prompted part of me to do some of this research is, seeing the guy with a rusty pickup truck going down the road with 47 pallets, barely hanging on to his truck. There is a place absolutely for the recyclers of the industry because they are doing a huge job, just like in the animal ecosystem. We talked about one of the key problems here is moving pallets to where they're needed, and that's exactly what those folks do. To your point, I'm not seeing as much intentional hoarding of these pallets. I really think it's an afterthought, and it has been for the industry for a long time of, maybe I receive this freight in and I'm just going to allow these pallets to pile up. I don't know what to do with them. The average recycler is going to pay you $2, $3 a pallet. So the economics don't necessarily incent you to move quickly. But if a pallet recycler is, runs by your warehouse and he's trying to make a few bucks, help him out. That would be my advice is there is absolutely a place in the industry for those guys with rusty pickup trucks driving around trying to find pallets to recycle.
There you go. All right, Andrew, thank you for joining us. Always great to have you. Enjoy your long weekend. We're going to head to another quick break, and then we'll be back with our next look at weather and the next edition of the Social Roundabout.